Hello, welcome. It's Friday. Yay, it's Friday. It's raining. Not so yay, it's raining. Well, actually it's stopped now, but about half an hour ago it absolutely poured down here, having rained on and off all day. Guess it's good for the garden, but actually, God, it's cold. I've got my favourite cardigan back. This is something I wear almost all winter long. And I was wearing it every time I went into school to do school workshops. So I did a lot of workshops this spring. I did a week in Norfolk, and then I did a week in Somerset, and then I did World Book Week around my own home area, mostly in Wiltshire and over towards Bath. And then I went to Norfolk again for another week, all of which feels very weird and long ago now. But I managed to leave this behind on my very last day, and I left it with the friend I was staying with in Norfolk, and I then discovered it in our woodpile about 3 days ago, where the postman had obviously tried to deliver it at the point that was before the corona lockdown, so they didn't assume I'd be at home, and he'd put it on the woodpile. Fortunately, it was in a waterproof thing. Anyway, it's like a wearable hug. I absolutely love it. So yeah, I'm trying to keep myself a bit warm because I'm a bit cold. Anyway, we are up to chapter 5. So Joe has been out foraging for food, for berries. They've collected hawberries, which come from the hawthorn. We get those, obviously. We don't eat them these days. They're very small, really very small, and quite sharp. The Vikings would have used honey to sweeten them. Joe says, well, why don't you use sugar? And Lucy doesn't know what sugar is. And when they're hoping to find something to eat, he said, well, maybe we could catch a rabbit. And she doesn't know what a rabbit is. So there's no potatoes, because they come from America originally. There's no tomatoes. There's no rabbits. There are hares, but there are no rabbits. There's no sugar. So their diet was actually quite different to ours in many ways. So they eat a lot of root vegetables, sort of carrots and turnips and things, but the carrots weren't orange either. Carrots were kind of whitish, well, sort of yellowish white, a little bit like parsnips, or sometimes they were purple, not orange. Yellow they were as well, properly yellow, so whitish, yellowish and purple, but not orange. So yeah, Joe's been foraging. They've come back to the city and they have avoided Thorbiorn on the way back in, which Lucy is clearly very, very grateful for. Thorbiorn is her cousin, and there's been a feud between the families, and Thorbiorn hates them still, even though the feud has been sort of patched up by marrying one member of the family to another. So the feud's been patched up, but Thorbiorn still hates them, and while Lucy's father and eldest brother, are away, he's out to make trouble. And now he's waiting. Well, he's not waiting. He is in the yard when Joe's sent out to put some moss in the basket for wiping your bum, in the sort of wattle kind of construction area where the cesspit is. Joe goes out, and there is Thorbiorn, and he's there to steal some chickens. And he says that Joe's going to take the blame for him. And he pulls out a knife. And it's at Joe's throat. Chapter 5. Joe stood completely still. It's very handy that you came out, actually, Thorbiorn murmured. Better, really, than Pedder. Joe said through gritted teeth, I'm not taking the blame for you stealing their chickens. It's all right, Thorbiorn shrugged. I don't need you to agree. You'll be doing it whether you like it or not. When it comes to the General Assembly, they'll be much more likely to believe it was you who took the chickens, rather than me. I'm a member of one of the great warrior tribes, whereas you? Nobody knows you. You're just a wandering vagabond who came into Jorvik to steal from honest townsfolk. Lucy and her mother won't think that. They won't believe it. Lucy? Is that your pet name for my little cousin? I like it, Thorbiorn sneered. Joe ground his teeth together. Aileen already knows you stole Pedder's fish. She'll guess it was you. He winced as Thorbiorn scraped the blade of the knife over his throat. "Careful what you say," the other boy hissed. "I could just slip with this. Save you the pain of having your little fingers cut off for the theft." Joe closed his eyes to hide his fear. The hissing sound seemed to spread out from Thorbiorn's voice into the air around him. It was growing louder all the time. He felt dizzy. All at once, there was brightness behind his eyelids. He opened his eyes again. He was standing with his face pressed to the glass of a shop window, on the crooked street in York where he'd dropped his St. Christopher. He blinked, disorientated. It was dazzling, and it was so noisy and crowded. He felt his breath rush out in a gasp. He'd got away, thank goodness. A few seconds more, and he might even have been killed. He wondered whether Thorbiorn would have gone through with it. Perhaps not, but he was glad he hadn't had to find out. He turned round. The crowd of Japanese tourists which had separated him from Sam and Dad was still trailing past. "Let's go in here," Dad called over. Joe crossed the street to the cafe Dad had gone into. He felt like hugging him. It seemed so long since he'd seen him. Of course, even in Lucy's world, only 24 hours had passed, but it felt much longer. Meanwhile, no time at all had passed here. He should be used to that by now, but it still seemed incredible. The cafe was warm and snug, with lamps on every wall. "We're so lucky, aren't we?" Joe said as he sat down, "to have all this light indoors." Dad smiled, surprised. "I suppose so. It's only relatively recent. In the grand scheme of things, even the gas lamps that were put in the 1800s were pretty dim, and before that mankind was more or less in the dark from dusk till dawn." Sam rolled his eyes. "You two talk about the weirdest things. Why can't we talk about the kind of stuff that ordinary families talk about?" "Like what?" "I don't know. What's on TV? What's for dinner? That kind of thing." Joe's tummy rumbled loudly as though in answer to Sam's remark. He might have had lunch with Sam and Dad only a few hours ago, but his body felt like he'd eaten nothing but apples and nuts since the bowl of chewy grey porridge this morning. "Can I look in the cave?" he asked Dad. "Of course." Joe chose the biggest piece he could see, even though it wasn't his favourite kind. At dinner time he had seconds of the stew Dad had made. "Aren't you a hungry horse today?" Dad said, clearly pleased. "You've no idea," Joe replied silently. Out loud he said, "What does hair taste like?" "That's a funny question. I'm not sure I've ever had it." Dad put another dumpling on Joe's plate. "I'd guess it's quite gamey, like pheasant or venison, but I don't know that you've eaten either of those, have you?" Joe shook his head. But he knew that if he got back into Lucy's world again, he would very likely end up eating one or another of those animals at some point. For the next 2 days, however, there was no sign of him slipping through time again. He didn't mind. There was so much pleasure to be had from simple things like good food and soft chairs. So he went along happily with what Sam and Dad wanted to do. He felt much more relaxed, too, than he had done at the start of the holidays, when he'd been constantly hunting for places to drop his St. Christopher. He smiled at the thought of himself searching for Roman remains, when Lucy had turned out to be in another time altogether. By Friday morning, though, the novelty of being back had worn off. He kept thinking of his St. Christopher hanging around Lucy's neck. What had happened after he'd vanished from Thorbiorn's grasp? Had the older boys stolen the chickens? Had anyone caught him? Or would they assume it had been Joe, since he'd disappeared at the same time? It worried him that if he got back into Lucy's time again, he might find himself about to get his fingers chopped off, just as Thorbiorn had threatened. But still he couldn't stop himself from wanting to be there again, to be spending time with Lucy, to be part of her life. It really was like an addiction. As soon as he got used to his own life again, he always started wanting to go back. It was so vivid, more real somehow than real life itself. "We still haven't been to the Viking Centre," he said over breakfast. Dad looked up. "I'm afraid the queues have been terrible every time we've gone past." "I think we ought to go all the same," Joe persisted. "Sam wanted to, didn't you, Sam?" His brother nodded. "It said on one poster that it has the sights, sounds and smells of Viking life." "Oh no, I hope not," Joe said with feeling. His brother stared at him. "What? Why not?" Joe turned red. He'd spoken without thinking. "I'm guessing it would smell disgusting," he said, to cover his mistake. "How would you know?" "I wouldn't," he lied, and got up from the table to rinse his bowl. "I'd like to go anyway, please, Dad." "All right, since both of you want to." His father smiled. As they walked through the streets of York, Joe looked around for any sign of Lucy's time in the buildings around him. They might well be on the same ground he had walked on with her. But of course the timber and thatched houses had disappeared hundreds of years ago, and the wooden bridge across the river had gone too. He couldn't even work out whether the street layout was the same. Dad wasn't joking about the queue. They shuffled along for nearly an hour as it snaked back and forth outside the building. Joe kept his spirits up with the thought that it was worth the wait just to have the chance to stand on real Viking soil again. After all, this was the place where they'd done the famous excavation and found all the Viking remains. Better still, the Jorvik Centre turned out to be on Coppergate, the actual street where Lucy had lived. He couldn't help hoping that he might manage to slip back into her world somehow. It felt like fate, even though he knew that it didn't necessarily work like that. Tomorrow they were going home, and then he would be over 200 miles away. Surely he was much more likely to find the way back when he was in the right place. Eventually they reached the front of the queue, bought their tickets, and went down the stairs. Joe tingled with excitement. Perhaps Lucy's house would be recreated here, and there would really be a door he could go through that would take him back in time. At the bottom of the stairs he stopped. Over the heads of all the people already in here, he could see a huge video screen showing an information film. Around the sides of the room were brightly lit cases of objects which had been found during the excavation, interspersed with touchscreens offering more information and short films. He looked down. Beneath his feet was a glass floor, and underneath that was some kind of reconstruction of the dig, also lit up. He shook his head at his own surprise. It was extremely well presented, and yet it wasn't at all what he'd been expecting. He tried to work out what he'd imagined. Firelight in the darkness, perhaps, like being inside Lucy's house, and being able to stand on the actual soil where Lucy had stood. But of course no visitor's centre could possibly do either of those things. You couldn't have a real fire in a building like this, and without electricity, nobody would be able to see anything. As for standing on the soil itself, it would have been worn away years ago with the thousands of feet that tramped through all the time. It was ridiculous to feel disappointed. "Look at this," Sam called out. Joe wove his way across the room to his brother, still trying to adjust in his mind. "These interactive things are cool. Look." Sam touched a screen and started a video. "There's another one over there as well." Without waiting to watch even 30 seconds of the film he'd started, Sam disappeared across the room. Joe stood and watched the video, then looked around to see where Dad had got to. He was watching the film on the big screen. Joe squeezed through to stand next to him. As long as he forgot any idea of getting back into Lucy's world, there ought to be plenty of useful information he could get out of this visit. "When did the Vikings come to York then, Dad?" he asked as the film came round to the beginning again and his father moved away to look at the displays. "In 866, Dad said. They settled here permanently in 876. It was known as Jorvik, which is where the centre gets its name from. Joe scratched his head. So what happened in all the time between the Romans building Fishbourne and the Vikings settling in Jorvik? That's 800 years. Well, the Romans were here in Britain, in York too, until just after 400, and then comes the bit that we call the Dark Ages. Is that because there wasn't any light? Dad laughed. No, if that had been the case, the Dark Ages would have gone on for much, much longer. No, it's the period from about 500 to 1100, so it includes the Vikings. We call it the Dark Ages because we don't know very much about it. They drifted along the cabinets, pausing to look at some of the artefacts. There were knives among them, the handles gone and the blades dull and chipped here and there along what would once have been the sharp edge. How odd, Joe thought, that one of these could really be the very same one Thorbiorn had held to his throat just a few days ago. Hundreds of years buried in the ground had robbed them of their menace. So, were the Anglo-Saxons in the Dark Ages then? He asked as they moved along. Yes, though first there was a lot of fighting between different tribes after the Romans left. There wasn't really anyone in charge, you see. So there were the Britons, who were here already, who we sometimes call Celts, and there were the Picts in the north. The Angles, Jutes and Saxons came over from Scandinavia and Germany, invited by the King of the Britons to help him beat back the Picts. And then they took over. Basically, yes. It's hard for us to imagine, but it must have been a very violent time. The Angles and the Saxons helped the Britons, and then turned on them and pushed them back into Cornwall, Wales and Scotland, and across the Channel to Brittany and France. If you think about it, those are the places where you might hear a different language being spoken, and where the people have their own regional identity, even today. Joe grinned. Never call a Welshman English. Quite so. Big mistake. Dad pretended to punch Joe. I should never have let your mother lure me away from my Welsh forebears. Anyway, the language we speak now goes back to that time. And so do a lot of our place names, even the ones we think of as Roman, ending in Chester or Castor or Cester, like Winchester and Doncaster and Leicester. So it wasn't the Romans who did that? Joe said. I was wondering about that before. They called the town near Fishbourne Noviomagus, but we call it Chichester. That's right, that'll have been the Anglo-Saxons. And what about York? I thought this was a Roman fort. It was, but it was Eboracum to the Romans, and Eorfowich before the Vikings came. They checked shoe in one of the glass cases. Imagine wearing that, Dad said. You'd feel every stone in the ground through the leather sole. That would be so uncomfortable, don't you think? I don't have to imagine it, Joe thought. I know. You'd probably get used to it, he said, and then wondered whether that was true. Had he stopped noticing it, really? Or was it just that everything in Lucy's world was so different that his brain ignored the little things and focused on the important stuff? Maybe. Dad raised an eyebrow. So, did the Vikings come after the Anglo-Saxons? No, they were around at the same time. The Vikings started raiding England, looting monasteries and churches and terrorising whole villages. The Anglo-Saxons kept having to fight them off, and when that didn't stop them, they tried paying the Vikings to stay away. It was a lot of money, called Danegeld. Not surprisingly, the Vikings thought that was a wheeze and came back asking for more. Eventually, the Anglo-Saxons agreed that the Vikings could have a large area in the north of England, including York, known as the Danelaw, while the Anglo-Saxons kept control of south and central England. And the people who settled here were Danish, were they? Joe thought of Lucy's family. She had said they were speaking Danish, and the boys had Danish names. Probably, but possibly also Norwegians and Swedes too. I'm no expert on that. At that moment, Sam reappeared. Oh, good. You're in the queue. The queue? Are we? What for? There's a sort of ride over there. That's what all these people are waiting for. The cars keep coming through, so we won't be long. He went and stood beside Dad. Joe fell silent, not wanting to ask any more questions in front of Sam. As they moved forward, he tried to digest what Dad had said and what it meant for Lucy. Had she just jumped forward in time by 800 years? Or had she lived other lives in between that he hadn't seen? In late Roman times, say, after the palace at Fishbourne had burned down? Or as a Saxon, coming over from Germany with her family? Or a Celt, forced to flee into Scotland or Cornwall? There was no way of finding out. There was no point in asking her when he saw her next either, since she didn't remember the other life that he knew she'd had. They reached the front of the queue. "Are you ready to experience the sights, sounds and smells of the Viking Age?" asked the attendant as they climbed into the waiting car. "Press the Union Jack button for commentary in English and let us take you back in time." He pulled down a bar across their laps. The car moved slowly along its rails into a reconstruction of a Viking street. Joe felt his pulse quicken. This was supposed to be the street where Lucy had lived, and it did look sort of similar. Surely it couldn't be a coincidence that he was here on the exact same spot of all the places he could have been in York. He leaned forward and looked keenly at the figures and houses around him. There must be a way to get back to her. Fate had brought him here for a reason. He just had to find the right moment. So that's the end of chapter 5. Can he get back? Will he do it while he's at the Jorvik Viking Centre? Will he be able to get off the ride? The bar that comes down across your lap's quite tight, needless to say, because they don't want people climbing off. I've been there and been on it, because when I do write these books, I do a lot of research, so I have been there. I also had this book checked for me by somebody who knows an awful lot about things like how to knit Viking socks. So there are all sorts of, people out there who you wouldn't know what they all know about, particularly the people who do living history. They are an absolute mine of information. Anyway, that's it for this week. So it'll be 5 o'clock on Monday for chapter 6. So I hope to see you there then.